In 23 AD, a man named Aelius Saturninus was brought before the Senate for trial. Cassius Dio writes, on the charge of having recited some improper verses about him, and upon his conviction to be hurled down from the Capitol. Now the hymn, improper verses about him, it's improper verses about Tiberius. And this, to be hurled down from the Capitol, was indeed the general method of execution for what the Ernest Carey translation of Cassius Dio calls maiestas. Now the Greek is this word asevia. Why this is translated as maiestas, I don't know. My J.C. Rolfe translation of Sejanus refers to the stairs of mourning. So the convicted were killed and tossed down the stairs of mourning. Tacitus refers to these as the Gemonian steps. And this form of execution goes back to the days of the Tarpeian Rock. So we have to piece together that this was the form of execution because the historians seem to think we should already know it. Where Suetonius tells us Agrippina died, he writes, he, as in Tiberius, he exiled her to Pandateria. He had her beaten by a centurion until one of her eyes was destroyed. When she resolved to die of starvation, he had her mouth pried open and food crammed into it. She persisted in her resolution and so perished. Suetonius continues to scold Tiberius for actually taking credit to himself for not having had her strangled and her body cast out on the stairs of mourning. So these lines help us understand the method of execution under Tiberius. Suetonius continues to tell us that things got out of hand with these treason trials. Not a day passed without an execution, not even those that were sacred and holy. So what were these people executed for? Saying things and writing things. Suetonius writes, a poet was charged with having slandered Agamemnon in a tragedy, a writer of history of having called Brutus and Cassius the last of the Romans. And how were these traitors discovered? They were discovered by informers everywhere, working for the commander of the Praetorian Guard, Lucius Sejanus. This one case Tacitus tells us about is absurd. This is the entrapment of Sabinas, who had actually been a successful military commander. So 4 men conspired to expose him as being critical of Tiberius. Tacitus writes, one of them, this is one of these 4 men, one of them, Lucanius Latiaris, who knew Sabinas slightly, should trap him with a view to prosecution. So Latiaris, after some casual remarks, complimented Sabinas on his unshaken adherence to the family he had supported in its prosperity. By this he meant the family of Germanicus. So Latiaris is pretending to be his friend, pretending to sympathize with him, that Germanicus' family has been under assault by Sejanus, as we already heard. Agrippina goes down because of his manipulations. Tacitus continues, Sabinas burst into tearful complaints. So now Latiaris has earned this man's trust. So now Sabinas sought out Latiaris' company, frequenting his house and unburdening his sorrows. So in order to prove his guilt, in between roof and ceiling, they crammed 3 Roman senators. In this hiding place, they applied their ears to chinks and holes. Between roof and ceiling, members of the Senate were overhead listening in on this private conversation. Once Sabinas was trapped in this manner, the city was understandably on edge. Tacitus writes, at Rome there was unprecedented agitation and terror. People behaved secretively even to their intimates, avoiding encounters and conversation, shunning the ears of both friends and strangers. Even voiceless inanimate objects, ceilings and walls, were scanned suspiciously. To this, Suetonius adds, every crime was treated as capital, even the utterance of a few simple words. He continues, every one of those who were executed was thrown upon the stairs of mourning and dragged to the Tiber with hooks, as many as 20 being so treated in a single day, including women and children. Commenting on this, Cassius Dio makes this sardonic observation. While investigating carefully, case by case, all the slighting remarks that any persons were accused of having uttered about him, he was really calling himself all the evil names that men had invented. This is Cassius Dio talking about Tiberius, calling himself all these evil names. Cassius Dio continues to say that often this is Tiberius still, often he falsely added from his own consciousness of his defects what no one had ever said, as if it had been really uttered. Now, this is the same historian that had reported to us the speech Maecenas had given to Augustus. No ruler should ever assume that the populace believes what they actually say to the emperor, but to deduce their thoughts by, and this is close to the quote, by what is natural for them to think. In my first video on the reign of Augustus, I had mused that this concept could be a revealing one. That when you say to someone, "You think I'm an asshole, don't you?" you're revealing to some extent that you think you're an asshole. That's what Cassius Dio is saying about Tiberius here. It is sometime around 28 AD that Tiberius left for the island of Capri. He withdrew here for his bizarre personal gratifications. Tacitus writes, he issued an edict forbidding the disturbance of his privacy. He was already there. If we trust the chronological order of Tacitus, then he was already there before the prosecution of Sabinus with the senators in the ceilings. And it is for this reason that the Romans viewed these trials for Maestas as the work of Sejanus and not Tiberius. But as far as that goes, the historians can't quite tell us what this relationship was really like. There is no one to tell us about the nature of their private communications. And in Sejanus, if this were fiction, the character of Sejanus would be an archetype, the unscrupulous minister who we will see again in history in the form of Cardinal Richelieu, of Thomas Cromwell, of Oxenstierna, and Colbert. So it is interesting to note, though, that Sejanus was not tasked with anything of importance other than these activities. He was sort of confined to Rome itself. And Tiberius confounds the historians with his total lack of administrative blunders. Cassius Dio writes, he was not believed to be really insane, since he handled all other matters in a thoroughly competent manner. He was never outmaneuvered. He never really messed up. And Tacitus is great for not resolving this. This sentence appears near the beginning of chapter 7 of the Annals. The emperor himself became tyrannical, and there's a hyphen, or gave tyrannical power. So this is taken from the Michael Grant translation, and it leaves us with two clauses that are hardly satisfactory to a reader who prefers easy conclusions. To Sejanus, Tacitus ascribes an unbounded lust for power, a blend of arrogance and servility. So when Tiberius leaves for Capri, we may believe that he essentially left Rome to the mercy of Sejanus. This feels like it's a little bit of a mistake, or at least it's an imperfect conclusion, because take these lines from Tacitus. Like most historians, I attribute his withdrawal to Sejanus' intrigues. Yet since he maintained this seclusion for 6 years after Sejanus' execution, I often wonder whether it was not really caused by a desire to hide the cruelty and immorality which his actions made all too conspicuous. And these lines from the year 29 AD are odd, where Tacitus tells us that the Senate voted the erection of altars to mercy and friendship, the latter to be flanked by statues of Tiberius and Sejanus. And this is the interesting part. The Senate also repeatedly begged them to vouchsafe a view of themselves. The them in that sentence is Tiberius and Sejanus. In 29 AD, the Senate felt uneasy that they could not make visual contact with both of them, not just Tiberius. The Senate repeatedly begged them, Tiberius and Sejanus, to vouchsafe a view of themselves. We'd like to lay eyes on you. Both men were absent from the city for long periods of time, such as that they made the Senate uneasy. And in these next lines, we see that these two men didn't care that they made the Senate uneasy, but neither came into Rome or near it. They thought it sufficient to leave their island and show themselves on the Campanian coast, their island. I suspect that these two men were libertine sadists who had kind of bonded with their similar affinities, and it feels more like Tiberius was always the emperor to me, and that Sejanus was delegated acts of malice within the confines of the city of Rome. Now, unfortunately, the section of Tacitus that pertains to the fall of Sejanus is lost. He fell, essentially, as he achieved the height of his power. Cassius Dio writes of the situation by 30 AD. Now Sejanus was growing greater and more formidable all the time, so that the senators and the rest looked up to him as if he were actually emperor. Now, I don't know if this is where we get the word mutilated from, but Cassius Dio tells us that Mutilia Prisca, against whom some complaint had been lodged, entered the Senate chamber and there stabbed herself with a dagger. At the height of the treason trials, Cassius Dio explains the financial rewards for the informers. All who accused any persons received money, and large sums too, both from the victims' estates and from the public treasury, and various honors besides. So it seems a little obvious why this is a problem. Not only is it obvious that this is going to give rise to false accusations, but it taints the reverence of the virtuous to similarly honor the vicious. Cassius Dio writes, "There were cases too, where men who readily passed sentence of death obtained images and honors. Hence, several distinguished men who were held worthy of some such honor would not accept it, lest they might one day be thought to have been men like these." Impressed with the forbearing goodness in a few men, Cassius Dio would have us be in this awful period of time. More wisdom from Cassius Dio on the sort of men who seek adulation. Those who enjoy an adventitious splendor seek very eagerly all such attentions, feeling them to be necessary to render their position complete, and if they fail to obtain them, are as vexed as if they were being slandered. The pretentious sort, the person who is dubious of their own worthiness, seeks praise, and if they are not treated with sufficient deference, it is as good as an insult. Now, the downfall of Sejanus had to be carefully orchestrated. Tacitus writes that Sejanus was guilty of a criminal attempt on the throne. But by 31 AD, Cassius Dio writes, Tiberius was no longer ignorant of anything that concerned his minister, was planning how he might put him to death. Now this was not so easy. Out of touch and caprice, Tiberius could not know if the people would be against Sejanus or not. He sent false reports of his health to stall Sejanus from launching a full rebellion. Cassius Dio writes, in order to take him off his guard as completely as possible, he spread the report that he was going to give him the tribunician power. Then he sent a communication against him to the Senate by the hands of Naevius Sertorius Macro. Macro entered Rome by night, as if on some different errand, and communicated his instructions to Regulus, then consul. The difficulty is that the Praetorian Guard was loyal to Sejanus, so the right men had to be on hand to make sure that Sejanus could be taken down. To effectuate this, Macro ascended the Palatine, for the Senate was to sit in the temple of Apollo, and encountering Sejanus, who had not yet gone in, he encouraged him, telling him aside in confidence that he was bringing him the tribunician power. Overjoyed at this announcement, Sejanus rushed into the Senate chamber. Macro now sent back to their camp the Praetorians that were guarding Sejanus. Then, after stationing the night watch about the temple in their place, he himself hurried away to the camp to prevent any uprising. These are the precautions that were necessary to bring down Sejanus. Cassius Dio continues, in the meantime, the letter was read. This is the letter that Tiberius wrote to the Senate. The letter was read. It was a long one, and at the close it said that he himself, that is Sejanus, must be kept under guard. So the whole Senate, believing this man was going to be appointed to the second highest position in the state, were informed that Sejanus was to be placed under arrest, and obviously it meant he would be killed. This must have been one of the most shocking moments in all of political history. It could be compared with the fall of Robespierre. as well as could the entire reign of terror during the French Revolution be compared with these treason trials. In fact, the executions of Danton and Desmoulins were in part because they had compared the culture of terror under Robespierre to the regime of Tiberius. Cassius Dio includes these lines to describe the aftermath on the Senate floor. He was so unaccustomed to having orders addressed to him that Regulus, raising his voice and also pointing at him, called the second and third time, Sejanus, come here. He merely asked, me? You are calling me? I think this helps us to understand the scale and magnitude of his denouement, the shock of it to he himself. The contrast between the status he previously had and the status he had in the hour of his downfall. But Cassius Dio treats us to lines that would not have us use this moment to think too highly of the liberated Senate, who had merely shifted from one pathetic subservient attitude to another. He writes, the him in this sentence is Sejanus. Him whom they were wont to protect as a master, they now guarded like a runaway slave. Him whom they had adorned with the purple-bordered toga, they struck in the face, and him whom they were wont to adore and worship with sacrifices as a god, they were now leading to execution. He was executed, and his body cast down the stairway. And what happens next is that the reign of terror simply shifts its target victims to former agents and friends of Sejanus. The populace slew anyone it saw of those who had possessed great influence with Sejanus. So we can see that there is a capricious turn, where previously you were guilty by association with the family of Germanicus, and that got you persecuted. Now, association with the family of Sejanus got you persecuted. Underlying all of this, though, is a further problem in this tyrannical system, and that is that when you read the historians, you don't get much of a sense that there is a legitimate political, ideological disagreement with Sejanus' camp and Germanicus' camp. Perhaps they want you to believe that Germanicus was a little bit more Republican. That's not that obvious. It looks like two different camps vying factionally based on self-interest for control of a tyranny. And that's it. So now we can go back to quoting Tacitus. Retribution now decreed against his remaining children. He had a son and a daughter. The girl, while she was being led to execution, the girl uncomprehendingly repeated, "What have I done? Where are you taking me? I will not do it again." And then the narrative continues to say that because capital punishment of a virgin was unprecedented, she was violated by the executioner with the noose beside her. Then both, as in she and her brother, were strangled and their young bodies thrown on the Gemonian steppes.